Okay. So once again, my name is Nicole Husbands. I'm the Young Adult and Outreach Services Librarian at Indian Valley Public Library. I apologize that my camera is not functioning at this moment, but I am happy to see all these familiar names and some new names on our participant list. If you know anything about me, you know that I am a person who loves the true crime section of Indian Valley Public Library. So when I saw that there's this person that I haven't really known about connected to the Lindbergh kidnapping, I was interested in learning more. So I reached out, and we have this wonderful person who's going to teach us a little bit about Ellis Parker. And so I'm going to be quiet and pass it over to the expert.
Thank you. So I'm Marisa Bozarth. I actually work for the Burlington County Division of Police in New Jersey. And I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background on who Ellis Parker is before we dive into his involvement in the Lindbergh kidnapping. So Ellis Parker was the county chief of detectives for Burlington County for about 40 years. And when he first started his career, he has zero training in any type of law enforcement or detective work. He was actually a violinist and ended up finding a stolen horse, and they asked him if he wanted a job after he found it. So he accepted and stayed for the remainder of his career, as eventually working up to being chief of detectives for Burlington County. His nickname became the Sherlock Holmes of America. So that probably gives you some idea of, how proficient he was at his job. He became known throughout the entire United States and also in Europe for his detective skills. And this was at a time when, unlike today, there was really no fingerprint experts. We weren't doing ballistics, things along those lines that they have to use today to help solve crimes. So a lot of his crime solving came strictly from observation, having the proper techniques for speaking to individuals that may have witnessed crimes or might know something, and getting them to give him the information that may help him to piece it together. So when the Lindbergh kidnapping took place, it happened about 15 minutes north of the Burlington County border. So being that he was the Burlington County chief of detectives, it did not fall into Ellis Parker's territory per se. It would have become a state police investigation. But he ends up getting very, very deeply involved, which we will go into, and you'll learn a little bit more about him and also the kidnapping itself and kind of what happens with him as it's going along throughout the program. But at least that gives you a little bit of background on who Ellis Parker is and why he's even involved in this whatsoever, in any way. So I'm going to start out with a timeline here, showing you kind of how the whole process played out. So a lot of times when we hear about the Lindbergh kidnapping, it sounds as if it takes place very quickly. Charles Lindbergh is kidnapped, they find a body, they find somebody that is eventually convicted of the crime, and next thing you know, he's executed and it's over. It happened quite as fast as sometimes the story leads you to believe. It was a fairly drawn out investigation, and Ellis Parker's piece with all of it actually leads several years later. So the whole timeline that I'm going to cover is an 8-year period from March of 1932, when Charles Lindbergh Jr. is kidnapped, until February 4th of 1940, when Ellis Parker eventually passes away. So just to give you a brief idea of kind of how this all plays out. So the whole story begins, of course, the day that Charles Lindbergh Jr. is kidnapped. He is taken from his home on March 1st of 1932. The home that he was actually kidnapped from was not the Lindbergh's main residence. This was a home in Hopewell, New Jersey, kind of secluded, meant to be a farmhouse, kind of a retreat for the family. And they happened to be there for a few days. It was under construction. They were there, which matters as we get into the story a little bit more. And while they were staying there, unfortunately, Charles Lindbergh Jr. goes missing. He was put to bed by his nanny on the second floor of the house. She went into an adjoining room. And about 2 hours later, when she came to check on him, he was not in his crib. The window was slightly ajar, and there was a ransom note on the windowsill. So the timeline of how this night kind of plays out is right around 9 o'clock at night. Charles Lindbergh Sr. hears wood cracking in the house or around the house. Being that it was an old farmhouse, it's under construction. It's, later in the evening. He didn't really think anything of it because, you hear what's happening, right? There's other people in the house moving about as well. So you're going to hear footsteps, creaky floorboards, maybe a loose shutter, things along those lines. But around 10 o'clock that night is when the baby is discovered missing. It is reported to the police, and about 10:40 that night, the police chief shows up on the property, and the police start searching the grounds. One thing to keep in mind throughout all of this is Charles Lindbergh, at this time in our history, is the hero of the United States. Right? Everybody looks up to Charles Lindbergh. Everybody wants to be him and fly. So when this happens, it becomes a national tragedy, and everybody wants to be the one that solves it. And they also allow Lindbergh himself to get very deep into the investigation. So when the Hopewell police arrive at 10:40, Charles Lindbergh and a butler that was living in the home were already out searching the grounds and dictate to the police where to search and how. If you follow crime TV shows, the news, anything, if it's your family that is involved in the crime, you are not leading the investigation. Right? You potentially are a suspect. They're going to be questioning you. This was not done the same way. So what they end up reporting is, first thing that was reported by the police was that there were 2 sets of footprints that were seen leading from the window area out into the woods. So what they figure is that most likely whoever took the baby needed to be in a car based on how the house was situated. You weren't walking up to it and walking away with an infant. So they had to have a vehicle, most likely looking to cross state lines. So around 11 o'clock that night, they set up checkpoints in New Jersey and New York, hoping to find a vehicle that had the child in it. And around 11:15, the state police start to show up. The first one on the scene for them was Corporal Joseph Wolf. The head of the state police at the time was Colonel Norman Schwarzkopf. If you remember Desert Storm with Storm and Norman, this is his father. And Frank Kelly, who was a CSI investigator. They arrive on the scene. They start looking for any fingerprints, any hairs, really anything that may have been left that can give them any indication on who took the baby and where they may have gone. Unfortunately, they don't find a lot. The only thing that they really find is a ransom note. This is the ransom note that is left. It is written in very poor English. They assume, based on the way that it is written, that it is a German individual who is involved. They also said the amount of money is a little bit odd, that they're asking for. You have Charles Lindbergh, who is one of the wealthiest people in the country at the time, and his father-in-law, who probably was the wealthiest person in the country at the time. And they only asked for $50,000 when they could have asked for a lot more. And they broke down exactly how much money they wanted in which types of bills as well on there. And the little markings that you see on the bottom, this big circle and kind of lines and half circles going on there, that is their telltale signature. So any other communication between the kidnapper and the Lindberghs should have that mark on it. If it does not, then it's fake, is what they determined. Ellis Parker, throughout all of this, he's hearing about it. He has friends on the state police force. He believes that whoever took the Lindbergh baby does not intend to actually kill the child. It is a kidnapping, simply a kidnapping crime. They get their money, they'll return the baby happy and healthy. It's just a ploy to get $50,000 from somebody. However, even though at the time he is, the most famous detective in the country, he is not asked to participate in the investigation. Originally, there were a couple issues. Ellis Parker, number one, is not from the right area, right? He lives in Burlington County. The crime took place too far north. So they said, it's not in your jurisdiction. You shouldn't be here. The other issue was the New Jersey State Police Force was a fairly new entity. And about 4 years prior to this, there was a huge murder that took place up there. And they ended up executing someone and found out that they had executed the wrong person. The state police botched the investigation. So this was a way for the state police to redeem themselves. They knew there were a lot of people in New Jersey that didn't feel we needed a state police force at this time. They felt like their little local, county agencies and their town sheriff's departments were good enough, right? They were solving crimes. They were keeping everything under control. Why do we need to pay for state? If the state police could solve one of the biggest crimes ever, then people would realize that they have some worth and we need them here. So they decided Parker cannot be involved. One of the other issues was the people involved in this whole thing. So Colonel Schwarzkopf and Ellis Parker did not get along. Never have. Prior to this investigation and all the way through it, the two of them butt heads constantly. They never wanted to share information with each other. If one of them, it was as bad as, if one of them said the sky was blue, the other one would argue that it's not. Just total opposites of each other. So he is not initially involved in the overall investigation. So in true Ellis Parker fashion, he can't just sit there and watch and see what happens. So he starts investigating himself based on information he's reading in newspapers, hearing on radios, information he's getting from people that are involved in the investigation a little bit. He's getting bits and pieces here and there. So he's using that to try and piece together his own case. So the people that end up getting involved in his investigation, these are the three main people that you'll hear me talk about often enough, is Schwarzkopf, the governor at the time, Harold Hoffman, and Paul Wendell. Governor Hoffman is on Ellis Parker's side throughout the whole investigation, believes everything he's telling him, but only has so much control over what's happening. Paul Wendell becomes the number one suspect for Ellis. So it all starts when Parker is getting information. He at first has no idea who is involved, who actually took the Lindbergh baby, but he receives a phone call at his office one day, and the person does not identify themselves. So there's an anonymous phone call where the person on the other end of the phone just says, "I know who took the Lindbergh baby and I could get him back." And they hang up. Ellis Parker got off the phone call and said, "I know exactly who's on the other end of the phone. It's Paul Wendell." So Wendell was a disbarred lawyer, just to give you some background on why he would know who he is. So he was a disbarred lawyer that Ellis Parker had worked with in the past. But he also had issues with Lindbergh's mother-in-law. Paul Wendell and her were not friendly at all. So there was a little bit of motive. He recognized the voice. So what Parker decides to do is says, well, if Paul Wendell knows who took the baby or is involved in it in any way, I'll ask him to help me investigate. Not leading on that he thinks he's involved, he invites him to his house and he asks him to help him get the baby back. So Ellis Parker gives Paul Wendell some money, and Wendell leaves, goes off, says he's going to his friends in order to bring the baby back, comes back with no money, no baby, and no information. So Parker does it one more time, gives him some more money, says, "Go, think you have an idea." Paul Wendell insists that the mafia is somehow involved in this whole thing. So Parker says, "Go, get me a baby back alive." And of course, he comes back without anything. But Wendell, throughout the whole thing, keeps talking about different things that take place during the kidnapping that he shouldn't know unless he is involved. So the one thing is he discusses the kind of tools that were used to actually access the nursery. He talks about using a chisel to get into the nursery and getting the window pried open. He also talks about a resident along the street in Hopewell that had a yellow porch light on. He says that when the baby was taken, they left the house down the front steps of the house with no shoes on, so nobody would hear them coming through. He moves frequently from March 1st until about 2 years later, about 1934, he starts moving. He rents an apartment in New York, then he's in a hotel in New York, in Brooklyn, then he's back living in New Jersey. He can't seem to stay in one place for too long. And also, he likes to show his power off. The kind of personality that Paul Wendell has he was very egotistical and very much like to show that he had power over everybody else or over someone else. So for him to potentially kidnap the Lindbergh baby, to say, "I pulled off the biggest crime and nobody knows it's me," that would mean something to him. So Parker's pretty sure that Wendell is involved, so he connects him immediately to it. The second thing that he does is he bites the bullet and he goes and asks Colonel Schwarzkopf for information and access to the crime scene, which is completely denied. But what they do for him instead is the state asks Ellis to head up the New Jersey Department of Motor Vehicles in their piece of the investigation. So this is kind of their way of letting him in without letting him have full access. Right? He's going to have access to documents and information just because he's part of it now in some small piece. But he's not going to be, running the investigation. He's not the head person, but we're giving him little bits and pieces, right? His assistant, when he is with the Department of Motor Vehicles, is a gentleman named Gus Lockwood, who you can see in that picture there. Gus Lockwood, who he really is only with him for a very short period of time, but near the end of all of this, remember his name, because he plays a very significant, although small, a very significant part in what happens with Ellis Parker. So remember Gus Lockwood. Okay. So while all of this is going on, about 2 months after everybody's investigating, nothing is being discovered. They have no leads at all. Unfortunately, on May 12th, 1932, the Lindbergh baby is found. He is actually discovered in the woods, only about a half a mile away from the residence in Hopewell. He's found by 2 truck drivers. Oddly enough, he is wrapped in a blanket, not buried at all. He's just laying in the middle of the woods, and 2 truck drivers pull over on the side of the road because one of them needed to use the bathroom. And this guy walks into the woods and stumbles across the body. So they report it, and now we have a bigger problem, right? Now we have a murder on our hands. It's no longer a kidnapping. So Ellis Parker publicly criticizes the state police for not finding the baby alive. He said there had to be a way for them to be able to turn in the ransom money, follow the trail and figure out where this child is before something like this happens. Now, most likely, because of where the baby was found and how, most likely he was killed within the first few minutes of the kidnapping taking place. There's speculation that the intention was not to murder Charles Lindbergh. The intention was to have a kidnapping and go through the whole process with the ransom money and everything, but that somewhere along the line when they were trying to move the baby, he fractured his skull, leading to his death. And they panicked, threw him into the woods, and took off. Nobody knows for sure, but that is kind of the leading theory on what happens here. So Parker criticizes the police for all of this, and he also gets the opportunity to examine the body. The governor, Hoffman, at the time, allows him to see the Lindbergh baby. And he says it doesn't make sense for how long the baby was out in the woods. He was only out there for 2 months. The body is way more decomposed than it should be. And at the same time that this is all taking place, there was another missing child who was about 2.5 years old at the time, who was also missing from Hopewell, from an orphanage. And Ellis Parker believed that the baby that was found was the child from the orphanage and not the Lindbergh baby. He said that based on the weather that we had had and how long this child would have been exposed to elements laying face down, it should not look the way it did. I spare you the pictures. If you are so inclined, you can look it up online, and there are pictures of the baby from when it was found online. They are very gruesome and not pleasant to look at. So I did not put them into the program. But they are basically bone. I mean, there is nothing left, unfortunately, of this baby. Charles Lindbergh does come and identify his son. One of the interesting things also to keep in mind during an investigation is as soon as within the first about 2 weeks of them discovering the baby, the Lindberghs had him cremated and buried. Now, it's an open investigation, right? Your only evidence at this minute is the child and the things that are with him. He was wrapped in a blanket that supposedly belonged to him, and sleeping clothes were still intact. So they are your only pieces of evidence, and they allowed them to cremate their son and bury him. So now there's really nothing left. So now, obviously, the state police has a bigger problem, right? So they go for almost, well, a year and a half. If you think the baby is found dead in May of 1932, it takes until September of 1934 to arrest anybody for this crime. They have absolutely no idea who took the baby. There's not one lead for almost 2 years. What happens that leads them to arrest Bruno Hauptmann is that ransom money shows up. So throughout the whole process, the Lindberghs eventually did pay $50,000 ransom money in a very bizarre manner. It all happened through ads in a newspaper where an unidentified man took $50,000 to a cemetery in Brooklyn and turned it over to somebody with nobody else around. No police followed to look and like spy even in a bush to see what was going on, to see who they're handing the money over to, nothing. But they recorded all the serial numbers of the money, hoping it would be spent. Well, nothing was happening with any of this money. None of it is being spent. So eventually, Bruno Hauptmann spends ransom money. He spends it at a gas station to obviously put gas into his vehicle. Gas station attendant records the license plate number, reports it to the police, and they go to Hauptmann's house and have him arrested for the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby. When they get to his house, he fits the bill. He speaks broken English. He's German. He is a carpenter, so he could have built a ladder. He would have the right tools to get in and out of the house. And he has ransom money in his garage in a shoebox. Not all of it, but he has some of it. And he has no idea how much he actually has. And one of the things that sped up his arrest and finding him too is the federal government decided that the Federal Reserve was going to collect, you had to turn in all your gold certificates. So anything over a certain amount, any bills that were high enough or any gold coins, anything like that had to be turned into a bank. And what that would mean for the ransom, whoever had the money, was that either you need to spend a lot of it quickly or it became worthless. So they knew we could just wait for somebody to spend this money, and he does. He says that the money is not his. From the very beginning, his story is that the money came to him from a friend named Isidore Finch, who traveled overseas, told him to hold on to this money while he was gone. And the guy wasn't coming back. So Hauptmann went into the garage, took some money out of it, and started spending it. Isidore Finch, we do know he died while in Germany. He contracted tuberculosis, died overseas, and never returned to America. So potentially a true story. We'll never know as to exactly how he came about all this money. But he also has some things that make you think it could be Hopman that did this crime. Right? So he lies about how many gold certificates he had. He also, not long after the time that the ransom money is paid out, he stops working as a carpenter. He's living on investments that he had recently made. He starts renting a house in Manhattan for no apparent reason. His wife and children are still living in New Jersey. They find out that he is illegally in the United States. He had tried to come to the United States once before from Germany and was actually caught as a stowaway on a ship and was sent back to Germany. His second attempt to make his way to the US obviously was successful, but he was illegally here. And he had a criminal record in Germany. Nothing as serious as kidnapping and murder, but he still did have a record. So he gets charged with felony murder. Oh, felony murder is interesting because it basically means that you committed murder while in the process of committing another crime. So the murder was accidental and was sort of a side effect of a different crime. So now the question is, well, what's the first crime? Because at this point in our history, there is no kidnapping law. Kidnapping is not a problem, or at least it's not seen as a big problem. At this time, you would get more time in prison for stealing somebody's chickens than you would for stealing somebody's child. It's very backwards from how we would look at things today. This case is what brings in what would become known as the Lindbergh Law, about transporting people across state lines and taking people against their will, things like that. But at this point, none of that exists. So they go with felony murder so that it's murdering someone in the course of another crime. And they say that the other crime was trying to steal the baby's nightgown. So he is technically charged with killing a child while stealing their clothes, which is kind of bizarre, but it was the only way that the death penalty could be on the table. In the state of New Jersey, at this point, second degree and third degree murder no longer carried the death penalty. It had to be felony murder or first degree murder. It was the only way it could be part of a case. And they really wanted it to be part of this case. So this is what they charge him with. Hopman's trial begins January 2nd of 1935. The evidence that is brought up by the prosecution is the ransom money. There's $14,000 of ransom money in his possession. They also do handwriting analysis between Hopman and the ransom letters and say that the handwriting is similar. The ladder that was used, you can see a picture of it actually in two different ways here. One is the ladder in pieces. So the ladder was built to come apart in 3 sections and then put kind of wedged back together when you get there. The other photo is the ladder up against the window at the home. So they said that he built the ladder and there is a rung on the ladder that matches a missing floorboard in his attic, apparently. They also say that the chisel that was supposedly used to open the window is in his toolbox. And there are 2 eyewitnesses that put him at the scene. Right. There's a couple weaknesses to their case as well, though. There are no fingerprints. There's no forensic evidence putting him at the house. There's no evidence in Hopman's house that the baby was ever in his car, was ever at his house, was ever in his possession. And probably one of the biggest holes is they only arrested one person and ever tried one individual. Why? Right? Their first report is 2 sets of footprints leading from the window out into the woods. Where's the second person? And Hopman isn't giving any of it. He's not telling them anything. So his defense, unfortunately, is terrible. He gets a public defender who is one of the worst lawyers. He comes to court drunk at times, doesn't seem to really care or know what he's doing, and the whole trial turns into a huge spectacle. There were people outside screaming and yelling. The jury stayed in the same hotel with the press and with public directly across the street from the courthouse. It was just a complete disaster. But their defense was that the New York Herald was going to pay for exclusive stories to it. So people are telling them whatever they want to hear. None of it is necessarily true. They also said it's probably an inside job because of the fact that the Lindberghs are not supposed to be home, right? It's not their permanent residence. So somebody had to know they were going to be there and also had to know where the nursery was, because nobody went into the nanny's room. Nobody went into the Lindbergh's room. The only footsteps go directly to the nursery window. So somebody had to know. And they also discredited both witnesses. One of the witnesses they discovered had been questioned twice. The first time he said he didn't see anything that evening. The second time, after he was given $250, he magically identified the car, the person driving it. He could tell you their license plate, everything about it. So that got thrown out. The other witness was an older gentleman who said that, yes, that evening he saw Bruno Hauptmann and his car going down the street towards the house. But when they put this gentleman on the stand, they put a vase of flowers on a table across the room and asked him to identify what was on the table. And he said it was a hat. He could not see. Unfortunately, he was pretty blind. So they said, well, if you can't see that in a lit up room, in the dark, you cannot tell who's driving a moving vehicle and what kind of car it is. So they got thrown out. One of their biggest mistakes that the defense made was they put Bruno Hauptmann on the stand. He spoke very poor English. He could communicate, but he very broken English, had a hard time understanding some of the questions that he was being asked, was always kind of asking them the lawyers to repeat themselves or to say things other ways. And sometimes, when there's a language barrier, things that he would say weren't necessarily always interpreted as they were meant to be. So he became very frustrated, and he comes across as very arrogant when he's on the stand. So it doesn't bode well for him. So while all of this is taking place, what is Ellis Parker doing? Right? He still thinks that Paul Wendell is the kidnapper, or at least is it. So in April of 1935, he gets permission to go visit Bruno Hauptmann in prison. So he goes to the state prison along with his secretary, Anna Bading, who speaks fluent German. It says there won't be a language barrier if I have a translator with me. So they go in, he interviews him for over 2 hours and comes out believing that Bruno Hauptmann is an innocent man. He starts to re-question witnesses and friends of Hauptmann. He also discovers that Isidore Finch, the one who left the money, paid cash for his plane ticket, for his tickets back to Germany, where he really was not in the financial means to do so. but he does. He starts going through all the trial records, trying to find any holes that he possibly can. He says that this whole thing, based on everything that he reads and knows, had to be long planned out. It was not a spur of the moment crime. Somebody thought through what they were doing. And he publicly attacks Hopman's lawyer and a gentleman named Arthur Kohler. Arthur Kohler was the wood expert that they brought in to say that the wood from Hopman's attic matches the wood from the ladder. And he rips his entire testimony apart in a newspaper article, saying that they don't actually match. They may be the same type of wood, but based on the time that they were planed, changes the colors of them, and nothing seems to add up, and publicly rips him apart. It does not go over well with most people, right? Most people don't want to be publicly humiliated by anyone. So none of that is going over well, but Governor Hoffman is very much starting to question if Hopman is actually guilty, and he's starting to lean more towards believing Ellis Parker and wanting to give him more insight and let him into the crime. So December of 1935 rolls around. There are rumors flying all over the place that Ellis Parker has found new evidence that will prove that Bruno Hopman is not guilty. And he is asked by several news agencies to reveal his evidence, and he says no. He keeps denying that he has any. One thing with Parker throughout his entire career is he never gave up any information until he had everything he needed. He made sure all his ducks were in a row before he turned over his suspect. There were no questions left to be asked. So for him to say that there's no new evidence doesn't necessarily mean there isn't. He just doesn't have enough to make a solid case yet. So he says no, but the governor sets up a team to help him. He gets fingerprint expert, he gets handwriting expert, he gets several people from the CIA, and they are given, Parker and this team are given 30 days to see if they can come up with new evidence and solve the crime. The state police are also given 30 more days to reopen the case and investigate further. The state police don't find anything different, which isn't surprising, because if they do and it faces the other way and shows that maybe they have the wrong guy, now they look bad again. That's the last thing they need. So all of a sudden, they're not finding anything. But Parker is working and getting more and more info, which is helpful for him. They end up getting Bruno Hopman, after he is found guilty of the crime. Ellis Parker, throughout his work, gets Hopman 2 stays of execution, so they could continue investigating and see if there's any words to what he's saying. So Ellis Parker, like I said, believes Paul Wendell is involved and knows something, but he can't quite get all the pieces together. So he comes up with a plan to get Paul Wendell to confess. If you have a written confession, nobody can deny a confession, right? So he comes up with this plan to arrest Paul Wendell. Now, I put it in quotes because they don't arrest him legally, right? He is going to have him isolated and confined in a house until he gets a confession out of him. The confession is going to find its way to Ellis Parker, and Paul Wendell is going to end up in New Jersey in custody. That is his overarching plan. So to pull this off, he gets these three men to help him: Murray Blefeld, Martin Schlossman, and Harry Wise. All of them are ex-cons. Um, all of them Ellis Parker knew because he had worked on cases that they were involved in. So he gets Murray Bliefeld to help observe Paul Wendell, follow him around to see what he's doing. And the other two are going to help get the confession. They are all deputized by Ellis Parker at a diner in New York. They believe that what they are going to be doing with Ellis Parker is legal. They 100% believe that they are fully under the rights of the law to do what they are doing. They are not, but Ellis Parker has them convinced that they're okay to do what they're supposed to. So these guys go, they stake out Paul Wendell in a hotel in Brooklyn, figure out his comings and goings, and they pull up outside and they wait for him. They get out, they basically kidnap him, blindfold him, and put him in the back of the car. And they drive him to Murray Bliefeld's father's house and lock him in the basement. Now, Paul Wendell has never seen any of these guys before, but the fourth person involved in all of this is Ellis Parker Jr. The picture here, there's Ellis Sr., and that's his son there with him in his office. At the time, Ellis Jr. was working for the State Motor Fuel Tax Department, but he would become the go-between for Ellis Sr. and the kidnappers, the people that are taking Paul Wendell. He would do pretty much anything his father said. He idolized his dad. Didn't matter what he thought, he was going to do it. But he had to stay out of view because Paul Wendell knew who he was and would put pieces together if he was seen. So Ellis Parker was elsewhere in New York and would get phone calls from his dad and then go relay messages to the other three, who would then go do whatever they were told. So they had this big scheme. So they arrest him while dressed as a police officer, handcuff Paul Wendell and lock him in the basement. They end up tying his legs to a bench, pinning his arms. They disorient him the whole time. He's in there for about a week. And they try to disorient him by, they cover up the windows so he never knows if it's day or night. They turn lights on and off at very odd hours. They put cotton in his ears so he can't hear any vehicles going by. And they feed him at very odd times. So he doesn't really know where he is or what's going on, or how long he's really been where he is. And pretty much every day, Ellis Parker would call and say, "Do we have a confession?" And they'd say, "No." They'd say, "Well, go try and get it again." So the three would walk into the room and they would torture Paul Wendell. They stretched his body, they beat him, and they actually burned him with a light bulb. It was pretty bad until he finally, after about 5 days, wrote a confession. So Wendell writes a 25-page confession. It is very general. There's not a ton of detail in it. There's enough, but he puts in a lot of personal references to it and details his childhood for whatever reason. But he also puts out false references to things that happened that day. So Paul Wendell's not stupid. He knows the law. And the very first line of his confession is that he left his sister's house to go to commit the crime, knowing he was never at his sister's. So first thing, when they go to the sisters to talk to her and she says he was never here, now the whole confession is questionable. Right? You can't trust any of it. There's a lot of inconsistencies to it based off of the other evidence that is shown. So he says that he was wearing gloves throughout the entire crime. He says that he used a thumbtack to pin the ransom note to the windowsill. There is no evidence of a thumbtack in the original ransom note. It was actually held there by a beer stein. He says that he left through the front door with no shoes. He talks about the death of the baby being accidental, that it was not an intentional, was not the purpose. He does not use Germanic language at all throughout the confession. And he is wrong about the amount of ransom money that was asked for. So there's a lot of things that make this confession very questionable as to if it's true or not. But he does it. And on February 24th of 1936, he is sent to what was known as 4 Mile Colony in New Jersey, where he rewrites his confession and he signs this note saying that he is willing to stay in custody until the investigation is concluded. So he actually gives Ellis Parker permission to keep him on 24-hour watch at 4 Mile Colony. So he is locked up there, and Parker goes to Paul Wendell's son with the confession and says, "Do you think your father could have actually written this and done this crime?" His son says yes. So now he has more kind of ammunition to push this further, but he has to get everything combined, get it in front of the right people. So Wendell is hanging out over in 4 Mile Colony while all of this is taking place. So everything starts to fall apart because what happens is Gus Lockwood, Ellis Parker's assistant from when he was with motor vehicles, is one of the people that Parker has watching Paul Wendell. After his shift was over, Gus Lockwood goes to a bar. And what do people do when they drink? That they start talking. So he's telling everybody that he is watching the Lindbergh kidnapper. He is keeping an eye on him, and it's Paul Wendell. So of course it spreads like wildfire that this is what's going on. So Paul Wendell ends up getting out of there, gets turned over to Mercer County because he was wanted on embezzlement charges there. His lawyer, attorney Willens, does not believe the confession whatsoever, has Wendell sign a document saying that it was forced out of him, that he was being tortured. And Parker tries very hard to get kidnapping charges and the murder charges with Wendell included in his Mercer County trial for embezzlement. And the judge says, no, you can't do it. They're two very separate crimes. They have nothing to do with each other. So he has to go on a separate case. So the state police, again, are given 48 hours to investigate the Lindbergh kidnapping further and get a stay of execution for Hopman again, now that all of this is coming out. Ellis Parker testifies against Paul Wendell in his embezzlement charges and tries to bring up everything that's going on. But the confession ultimately gets thrown out and the kidnapping charges are dropped against Paul Wendell. So no trial for the Lindbergh kidnapping. But because of the way everything fell, Wendell identifies the three guys. He identifies Blefeld, Wise, and Schlossman as being the three that locked him up and tortured him in order to sign the confession. He gets released on $10,000 bail, and he actually takes investigators directly to the room that he was held in New York. One of the biggest mistakes that the three did was when they were driving Wendell to the house, they blindfolded him until he was about 2 blocks away from where they were going, and then they took the blindfold off. So now he could see what's around him. Also, while he was in the room, he carved his initials into the door. And once he wrote the confession and he knew he was coming to New Jersey, he said he couldn't go without clean clothes. He hadn't showered in a week. There was blood on his clothes. They needed to do something. So they allowed him upstairs to shower, where he could look out windows. They also took his clothes to the local dry cleaner. When they returned, they didn't take the tag out of the back of his shirt. He took it off and bench he was tied to. So when he brought investigators to the house, there's evidence that is where he was. So Martin Schlossman gets arrested in April of 1936. The rest get arrested. Bliefeld and Wise get arrested a month later. And they tell about Ellis Parker Jr. being involved. They do not mention Sr. at this point. So there are indictments in King County, New York for them for those four and Ellis Jr. Ellis Sr. is the only one not at this point involved. One of the issues now was nobody could find Ellis Sr. or Ellis Jr., excuse me. Turns out when they eventually found him, he was hiding out in his father's house. So now Ellis Sr. is also harboring a wanted criminal. So things aren't necessarily looking up for him. So Ellis Sr. is eventually linked to everything that's going on. And on June 2nd, 1936, he is arrested at his home. He knew they were coming. The local police, being who he was, the local police called and gave him a heads up and said, "We're coming to arrest you at 2:00 this afternoon." When they showed up at his house, he was in front of the fireplace burning all sorts of documents and photographs. He apparently always said, up until the day he died, so did Ellis Jr., both of them had majority of their things destroyed upon their death. They both said that there were a lot of documents that they had that would cause harm to many prominent individuals, and they weren't allowed to defend it around any longer to defend it. So it's better if it wasn't around. So he was burning all of his things, ends up getting arrested. And they are one of the first people to be indicted under the brand new Lindbergh law, which said you cannot take somebody across state lines against their will. And if it's going to be a kidnapping, there has to be a reward or ransom involved. Governor Hoffman asked that they do not get extradited to New York. He really wanted their trial to take place in New Jersey because ultimately, even though what they did was terrible, he overall believed that they were right in who was the real kidnapper. So he wanted their trial to take place in New Jersey, where people knew Ellis Parker's background. He would potentially be on trial where the jurors, the lawyers, everybody would know the previous 40 years, not this one instance. They appealed many, many times because they said there's a lack of Negroes on their jury. It was completely unsuccessful. I mean, good try, but it did not work. They both plead not guilty. Bliefeld, Schlossman, and Wise plead guilty of the crime and testify against Ellis Jr. and Sr. They get sentenced to 20 years in Sing Sing prison for assault. Ellis Sr. is advised by the governor's lawyers to plead guilty of everything that went on with Paul Wendell, but take the stand, and when he's on the stand, convince them that Paul Wendell really is the Lindbergh kidnapper. That is your chance. and he said, "I will never plead guilty in court." So he went with not guilty instead. They end up going to court. The prosecution claims that Ellis Parker forced Paul Wendell to confess in order to gain a promotion. So the only way they could get Ellis Parker on anything is to prove that they already know that he was tortured and things, but to prove that he was behind it all, they also had to prove that he brought Paul Wendell across state lines against his will, and that it was for a ransom or a reward. So they're thinking for the prosecution, there's no ransom. The reward, he says, it's to gain a promotion, because there was a lot of speculation that Ellis Parker's next move was to try and take over Hoover's position with the CIA. Parker, up until his death, said he had no desire to ever leave where he was, but a lot of people thought that he was trying to build up to that. And if he solves the Lindbergh kidnapping case, he would be a shoo-in for that job. So there are several witnesses for the prosecution as well. Anna Bading, his personal secretary, who for some reason did not transcribe all the notes revolving around the Lindbergh kidnapping and Paul Wendell. They also put Wendell on the stand, who details his kidnapping, his torture, and the confession that he signed. Gus Lockwood is another witness who discusses his time with Wendell at 4 Mile Colony. And then obviously the 3 people that actually did the kidnapping and torturing. The evidence that they have is very damaging. Paul Wendell has bruises and scarring from burns on his body. So everything lines up to the torture that he discusses. And there's telephone records between Parker's house, Parker's office, and the house that he was held at in Brooklyn. There is no other reason for them to be doing that, other than worrying about, excuse me, other than worrying about, trying to figure out the confession and dealing with Wendell. So the defense, their whole thing was to say that Parker was not involved at all, deny it all. His witnesses, most of them were character witnesses, talking about previous things in his career, how well liked he was, how well respected he was. He would never do anything like this. The other witness was Clifford Kane, who was an assistant with the county detectives, who would actually go on to replace Ellis Parker as the chief of detectives later on. But he takes the stand to say when Paul Wendell was kidnapped and all of this was happening, he was with him in Mount Holly, New Jersey, which is highly possible because he told them what to do and then didn't go with them. One of their biggest mistakes too, though, was putting Ellis Parker on the stand. So they put him up there. He detailed the call that he got from the suspected killer that he claims is Wendell. He says that Paul Wendell offered to help get involved with everything. He denies meeting anybody else that was involved in this, which he was lying through his teeth. And when they questioned him too much, he said, "I don't have to answer to anyone when I investigate a case." So he came across very arrogant, very egotistical, like it just did not bode well for him at all. So in the end, the closing arguments for the prosecution are the same as the opening ones, that he kidnapped Paul Wendell and did it for the reward of a promotion. The defense claimed that Wendell would have been tried for the Lindbergh kidnapping if Hopman had not been, and that Murray Bleefeld can't be trusted. He's a criminal. You can't listen to anything he says, was their defense. The charge to the jury was that in order to find the Parkers guilty, 3 things needed to happen. If they questioned one of them, they weren't guilty. So they had to prove that, or fully believe that Wendell was kidnapped, that he was held for a ransom or a reward, and that he was transported against his will. The jury came back after a few hours and said that they found both Parkers guilty, but recommended leniency in their sentencing. Ellis Sr. was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Ellis Jr. was sentenced to 3. They ended up going to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. They appealed many, many times. All of them failed. They do get released on bail. They also get indicted in New York, but no trial ever actually takes place because they're all found guilty already. So that would be double jeopardy if they actually went to trial. They file 483 claims in a final appeal to the Supreme Court, which they were 483 claims is insane. A lot of them were very, very far-fetched. They were really pulling at straws. But their conviction is upheld on April 11th of 1939. They try to, there's petition upon petition upon petition to try and keep the Parkers out of prison. Thousands and thousands of signatures from lawyers, doctors, residents, people he had worked with in the past, people that he helped solve crimes for in the past, like anybody under the sun, to try and keep them out of prison. One, because people thought that it was a disgrace to him. You shouldn't be doing prison. The other one was his health was deteriorating. He was not a young, like he was not a very young man at this point. And he was suffering. So they said, if he goes to prison, he's going to die. He will never survive. It's not right to do. So they do end up going to federal penitentiary. Ellis Sr. has a stroke while there and ends up in the infirmary. So what everybody thought was true, ends up coming true. So once they're actually in prison, more petitions start in order to pardon them. Does not happen, at least not quickly. While all of this is going on, Paul Wendell sues New Jersey and the governor for defamation. He does not win, but he tries. And he also writes a book called The Hoffman-Lindbergh Aftermath, all about what he's doing with his life, which is basically he practices being a chiropractor for the remainder of his life. He gets involved in medicines and things. So he writes a whole book about what's going on there. But unfortunately, Ellis Parker passes away within a year. He passes away in early 1940. So he is not in prison very long. These are just a couple newspaper clippings from when he dies. Over 4,000 people come to his viewing. He is buried out of his family home in Mount Holly. The viewing took place in the parlor. The story is that the viewing was supposed to start in the evening, and there were so many people lined up through town that his widow said, "We can let them in now. Let's let them wander through." So they opened the doors about 4 hours early for the viewing. And the picture that you see here of these guy, kind of, I don't know if you can see my arrow very well, but the one with "As final tribute is paid, famed detective." The one picture, that is Ellis Parker's wife, his son Ellis Jr., and a guard from the federal prison, because they let Ellis Jr. out to go to his father's funeral. The other piece of that picture, the gentleman kind of running out of the house with the hat on, that is the governor. He came to the funeral as well. All of the lawyers that were involved in Ellis Parker's case and all of the lawyers that were involved in Bruno Hauptmann's case all came to the viewing and the funeral, along with several famous athletes from Philadelphia. It was insane the amount of people that were there. The pallbearers you see there, he's buried in Mount Holly Cemetery, eventually next to his wife and several children. All of his pallbearers are county officials and heads of departments throughout Burlington County. But the one person that came to the viewing that always sort of sticks out is Hauptmann's widow. So by this point, Hauptmann had been executed. His widow, who doesn't pass away until the late 1980s, she lives a very long time after all of this, up until her dying day, says that her husband is innocent. He never did anything, and that he was just a scapegoat. But she comes to Ellis Parker's funeral. She's one of the last people in the door. Ellis's widow has gone upstairs, has had enough for the day. And when Hauptmann's widow comes in, somebody went upstairs to tell her that she was there. And she said, well, I'll come downstairs to see her. So she came downstairs, and Hauptmann's widow put her hands on Ellis's body and just said, I want to thank your husband for everything he ever did to try and save mine. So just kind of very sweet moment between the two of them, that both unfortunately lost husbands in the midst of one major case. So this is a little bit kind of what happens to everybody following all of this. Charles and Anne Lindbergh never returned to their house in Hopewell. They end up moving to England and eventually to Hawaii. They don't really spend a lot more time in this area of the country. Anna Hauptmann, Bruno Richard Hauptmann's widow, she spends the rest of her life working for exoneration, and actually sues the state of New Jersey for wrongful death for his execution. Mark Kimberling, who was one of the first on the scene, eventually becomes the head of the state police force for a few years. The judge in the Lindbergh case, Judge William Clark, joins the Circuit Court of Appeals, ends up serving in World War II, and eventually becomes Chief Justice of the Allied Appeals Court at Nuremberg. Norman Schwarzkopf becomes a brigadier general, trains the Iranian police force, and ends up working for the New Jersey Department of Law and Safety. And at the very, very end, he narrated a radio crime show called Gangbusters. Governor Hoffman ends up, after his term, he ends up working for the New Jersey Employment Compensation Commission. And the day before he dies, he writes a letter to his niece confessing that he embezzled $300,000 from that agency, and then passes away the next day, so could never be charged for it. Murray Bliefeld gets indicted for filing false payroll claims. So does Martin Schlossman. They all serve out their 20 years in Sing Sing in New York. But Murray Bliefeld also sells what he calls the real story of what went on to author Philip Scaduto to write a book called Scapegoat, all about this whole instance, the Lindbergh kidnapping, Paul Wendell, and everything. Paul Wendell starts working for Dr. Benedict Lust and becomes a doctor of metaphysics. He ends up going to prison for 6 months for fraud, and he's caught practicing chiropractics without a license, so gets himself in some trouble. And he self-publishes a few books. Every one of the books that you have, where you write like the about the author piece, every single one of them mentions the Lindbergh kidnapping, that he is, yes, I'm the Paul Wendell that kind of got drug into that. So he still uses it all the time. Ellis's family, his wife Cora, lives at their home in Mount Holly until about 1950. She never receives a pension for him. There were more petitions trying to get her to receive his pension. And they said because of the fact that he died in prison, um, they're not allowed to give it to her. She did, however, receive a Christmas card every year until the mid 1950s. That Christmas card was postmarked from Brooklyn, New York, and all it said in it was, "I hope you're having a good year." No signatures, no nothing. They stopped in the mid 50s. She stopped receiving them right around the same time that Paul Wendell passed away. So we'll never know for sure, but there's speculation that he was the one sending her the Christmas card every year. Ellis Jr. ended up in October of 1941 being paroled for good behavior. And in January of 1947, he received a pardon from President Truman for his efforts. So he was completely cleared of everything. There was a big push to have Ellis Sr. pardoned as well. But at this time in our history, there had never been a posthumous pardon done. So it was highly unlikely that it's going to be. Now that there are posthumous pardons, and there's a precedent set, Ellis's grandson has compiled because binders upon binders upon binders of information, and has been attempting to get him pardoned by every president since Bill Clinton, and it has yet to happen. So unfortunately, I don't see it happening in that person's lifetime, but maybe, but I don't foresee it happening. But also Ellis Jr., he passed away in 1972 and directed that all of his stuff was destroyed as well. So there's not a lot of things left, tangible items relating to any of it, because they destroyed pretty much everything that was there. So there today, just to kind of wrap it up, even today, there is so many theories on what exactly happened with the Lindbergh kidnapping. Almost everybody I talk to, every article you'll read, book, anything about it, they all have their own kind of take on it. On is Hopman was he really guilty? Was he involved? Was it Paul Wendell? Is there somebody completely different? Did the Lindberghs do it themselves for one reason or another? And why? Was it actually the Lindbergh baby? Charles Lindbergh Jr. maybe was alive and well. Who knows? So there's a lot of kind of theories that float out there that we'll probably never know the answer to. But they're there. You can kind of make your own conclusions, or piece it together for yourself and see what you think. But unfortunately, Ellis got involved, may have had been going in the right direction with who was guilty. But we'll never know because he went about it in the wrong way, unfortunately. So does anybody have any questions about any of it?
Okay, if you if you do have any questions, you can unmute yourself at this time, or you can put it in the chat and you can read it. I'll read it out for you. I just want to thank you. I know we went a little bit over,
I'm
but
sorry.
but it was a very engaging story, and I really there were I thought I knew things pretty well, and there were definitely some facts that I didn't know. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, hi, I have a question. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
My question is about the home in New Jersey. Does anyone know what happened to it and what currently stands where the home used to be?
Yes, it is still there. It now belongs to the state of New Jersey. There are offices in the building. It's an office building. They've converted it. From the outside, it looks pretty much the same. The inside looks nothing like a house.
Would we be able to drive by it?
Yes. You can. If you, I don't know what the exact address is, but you can Google it. If you just Google like Lindbergh House, Hopewell, New Jersey, it'll come up. You can drive by it. You can't go inside though.
Okay.
But you can drive like down the road and up and around into their, like, they have like a big circular kind of driveway parking lot now. You could drive around if you so
Interesting.
wish. Yep,
Oh, thank you.
you're welcome.
So one of the things is, was the kidnapped baby from the orphanage ever found?
No. No, I can't go there. Unfortunately.
And I guess that kind of is related to someone else says, so they never found out who or if the baby was actually killed. And I guess that goes back to what you're saying. There's just a lot of theories around this whole case.
Yeah, there are. And one of the things, like, I didn't mention because it's more of a recent take, is they have a lock of the Lindbergh baby's hair, or who they believe was the Lindbergh baby. They have his hair in the state archive, like in the state police, still in evidence, I guess. And there's been a couple of times where they've asked Lindbergh relatives if they would be willing to do DNA testing now that it's available, and they always deny it. So we'll never know unless DNA gets done if the hair matches Lindbergh or not. But the Lindberghs, at least the descendants, don't at this time don't seem to want to kind of open that up, because if it comes back that it wasn't, now you have a whole nother case. It kind of opens up a big can of worms if it comes back wrong, I guess.
Okay. So another in here, and I think you said the baby was cremated, but I guess beforehand, was wondering if they ever thought to do an autopsy of the baby.
They never did one. There wasn't much there. I mean, I guess they could kind of do an autopsy. But it was mostly, hair, some teeth, and bones. There really wasn't much left, unfortunately, to really, dive into.
Okay, thank you. I just see people are, thank you for the presentation. Anyone else before we head out for the evening?
Yes, I'm just curious, has there been any more modern analysis of the Hopman floorboard and the ladder wood?
There has not been, at least not by any experts. Some of the things are actually on display at this. There's a state police museum in Trenton. So there's a small display, and they actually have like a piece of the ladder and the floorboard. They have part of the handwriting analysis in there. And I've seen it. I mean, I'm no expert on wood by any stretch of the imagination, but other people that I know who have viewed as well, they don't look like they should go together. They don't look the same. Without, being somebody that really knows what they're talking about in terms of, types of wood and how things are cut and all of that. But they just by eyesight, I wouldn't say they match, but who knows?
Okay, well, very good. I've read the book. I read quite a bit a couple of years ago about that. You did an excellent presentation. Very nice.
Oh, thank you very much.
Very good. Okay.
Thing. And also in the comments, someone said they could have been able to tell by his legs he had rickets. Someone wants to know how they accounted for the rapid decomposition.
They didn't. They never really explained it. The state police never said anything about it. Ellis Parker was really the only one that brought it up to say it didn't seem to make sense. How decomposed the body was for how long it had been out there in the weather, but the state never really addressed it. They said, nope, he's been identified, so that's who it is.
All right. And so again, thank you for the presentation. And another one says, interesting, the Lindbergh won't donate hair. Someone works in a forensic lab, which is really cool. I would love for you to talk to me about
Yeah.
it next time you see me in the library. And again, thank you for the presentation. So again, we are a little bit over tonight. I just want to thank everyone for being here. I am going to send out this recording once I get it up, and also some additional information, some books that we have in our collection and digitally about the case in Ellis Parker. So thank you and have a good night, everyone.